The old-timers at Chandler Airport say the place has a memory, and it's not a happy one. Working the hangar night shift, you learn to feel it. A cold, heavy presence that settles in after the last plane has gone, and the city lights are just a distant shimmer. It's the kind of quiet that lets you hear things you shouldn't, like the faint, rattling sound of a man shaking a tin can in the empty restaurant kitchen, or the whisper of footsteps in the terminal when no one is there. We've all heard the stories about the old man in the control tower watching ghost planes on a dead runway. But what really gets you is the feeling that he's not watching a plane at all, but rather watching us. My name is Danny Vasquez, and I've been turning wrenches at this airport for 8 months now. Before that, I was bouncing between auto shops in Modesto, barely scraping by after my divorce cleaned out what little savings I had. When my cousin Hector called about an opening at Chandler, night shift, decent pay, benefits after 90 days, I jumped at it. Fresno wasn't exactly my first choice, but it beat sleeping on my sister's couch in Stockton. The airport sits on the edge of town like an afterthought, surrounded by almond orchards and those cookie-cutter housing developments that sprouted up during the boom years. During the day, it's busy enough. Charter flights, cargo runs, flight training from the nearby school. But after 11 p.m., when the last Cessna taxis in and the tower goes dark, the place transforms into something else entirely. I should have paid attention to the way Luis Herrera, the day shift supervisor, always rushed through his handoff reports. How he'd glance over his shoulder while explaining which aircraft needed attention, like something might be listening. Or how Maria Santos, who worked the fuel truck, would cross herself whenever she had to drive past Hangar 7 after sunset. The job itself seemed straightforward enough. Basic maintenance on small aircraft, pre-flight inspections, replacing worn parts. Nothing I hadn't done before, just different machines. The pay was better than anything I'd found in the Central Valley, and the night differential meant I could actually afford my own apartment instead of sharing space with 3 other guys. But Chandler Airport holds on to things, keeps them close, and once you start working the night shift, really working it, not just punching a clock, but becoming part of the rhythm of the place, you begin to understand that some memories don't fade. They just wait, patient as the fog that rolls in from the coast, for the right moment to remind you they're still there. That's when Antonio Morales, the head mechanic, sat me down in the break room with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration, and handed me a folded piece of paper. 7 protocols, he said, his weathered hands steady as he pushed the paper across the plastic table. Follow them exactly, no exceptions. I unfolded the paper, expecting some corporate safety guidelines or union regulations. Instead, I found 7 handwritten rules in Antonio's neat cursive, the kind they don't teach in schools anymore. Chandler Airport Night Protocols. Never enter Hangar 7 between midnight and 3 a.m. If you hear the compressor running during these hours, do not investigate. If you see a man in coveralls walking the tarmac after 1 a.m., acknowledge him with a nod, but do not speak. He will nod back. Do not follow him. The coffee pot in the break room must be emptied and cleaned before 2:30 a.m. Do not drink from it after this time. If aircraft N847TC requests fuel or maintenance, refer them to the day shift. Log the request, but take no action. Keep the radio on Channel 7 at all times. If you hear a woman's voice asking for Johnny, respond, "Johnny's not here tonight." Then switch to Channel 9 for 10 minutes. The exterior lights on Hangar 3 will flicker 3 times at exactly 2:45 a.m. Count them. If they flicker more or fewer times, leave the facility immediately. Before dawn, walk the perimeter fence starting at the north gate. If you find the gate open, close it and report to Antonio in the morning. Do not look through the opening before closing it." "This some kind of initiation?" I asked, looking up at Antonio. His face remained serious, crow's feet deepening around his eyes. "You think this is a joke?" He leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight. "Ask Tommy and Nguyen what happens when you ignore protocol." "Oh wait, you can't. Tommy stopped showing up 3 weeks ago." The break room felt smaller suddenly, the fluorescent tube above us casting harsh shadows across Antonio's weathered features. He'd been at Chandler for 15 years, worked his way up from baggage handler to head mechanic. If anyone knew the airport's secrets, it was him. What happened to Tommy? Tommy got curious about Hangar 7, figured the midnight restriction was just old wives' tales. Antonio stood, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. Found his toolbox outside the hangar door the next morning. Tools scattered like someone had thrown them from inside. Tommy's truck was still in the parking lot, keys on the front seat, engine running. I folded the paper, tucking it into my shirt pocket. And the police? Police don't care about missing persons who might have just decided to start over somewhere else. Tommy was behind on child support, had creditors calling. Easy enough to assume he ran. Antonio headed toward the door, then paused. But his ex-wife called me last week. Said Tommy never picked up his final paycheck. Man desperate enough to run doesn't leave money on the table. My first week passed quietly enough. The night shift routine was simple. Check the maintenance log, inspect any aircraft scheduled for early morning flights, top off fuel tanks, and keep the hangars secure. The airport employed only 3 night workers: myself, Carlos Jimenez, who handled security, and Elena Vasquez, no relation despite the shared surname, who managed the fuel depot. Carlos was a stocky guy in his 50s who'd worked security at various valley locations, malls, warehouses, a couple of processing plants that shut down during the recession. He kept to himself mostly, making his rounds in an ancient Ford pickup that backfired whenever he hit the brakes. Elena was different, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of competence that suggested she could handle anything the job threw at her. "Antonio give you the paper?" she asked during my second night, nodding toward my shirt pocket. "Yeah. You follow them?" "Every single one." She checked her watch, a practical Timex with a canvas band. "Speaking of which, it's almost 2:30. Better handle that coffee pot." I found myself checking my watch constantly that first week, noting when the hangar lights flickered. Exactly 3 times at 2:45 a.m., just as the protocol stated. Listening for sounds from Hangar 7. The compressor did run some nights, a low industrial hum that seemed to echo from deep within the building. And walking the fence line each morning before my shift ended. The routine should have been boring. Instead, it felt like participating in some ancient ritual. Each protocol a small protection against something I didn't understand, but was learning to respect. By my 3rd week, the protocols had become second nature. I'd nod to the man in coveralls when he appeared on the tarmac, usually around 1:15 a.m., always walking the same path from the old terminal toward the cargo loading dock. He'd nod back, a brief acknowledgement between night workers, then disappear behind the fuel storage tanks. I never questioned why someone would be making rounds at that hour, or why his coveralls looked decades out of date. The coffee pot routine was trickier. That old Mr. Coffee machine had a mind of its own, taking forever to brew and leaving a burnt taste no matter how carefully I cleaned it. But I learned to set a timer, emptying and scrubbing it clean before 2:30 a.m. every night. Elena had warned me about the coffee during my first week. Had a guy a couple years back, Miguel Contreras, Worked the fuel truck before me, she'd said, organizing invoices at her desk. Real coffee addict. Figured the 2:30 rule was just Antonio being paranoid about leaving equipment dirty. She paused, tapping her pen against the desk. Found Miguel passed out in the break room one morning, coffee mug still in his hand. Couldn't wake him up for 6 hours. When he finally came around, he kept talking about drowning in black water, seeing faces in the bottom of his cup. Coincidence? Maybe. But Miguel quit that same day, moved back to Bakersfield. Haven't heard from him since. The fence walk bothered me most. Every morning before dawn, I'd grab a flashlight and walk the perimeter, checking for breaks or signs of intrusion. The north gate was always the final stop, a chain-link barrier that separated airport property from the old Ramirez citrus grove. Most mornings, the gate stayed locked tight. But sometimes, maybe once a week, I'd find it standing open, the heavy chain lying in the dirt like a discarded snake. Those mornings, I'd close the gate quickly, snap the lock back in place, and head straight to my truck. The protocol said not to look through the opening, and I understood why. Even in my peripheral vision, I could sense movement in the grove beyond. Shapes that didn't match the orderly rows of orange trees, shadows that seemed to shift against the pre-dawn light. The radio protocol proved the strangest. Channel 7 carried normal air traffic control chatter during busy hours, but after midnight, it mostly stayed quiet. When the woman's voice finally came through, asking for Johnny in a tone that sounded like she'd been searching for him for years, I nearly dropped the handset. "Johnny?" Her voice carried a static-filled longing. "Johnny, are you there?" My throat felt dry, but I managed the response Antonio had taught me. "Johnny's not here tonight." Silence stretched across the airwaves for several heartbeats. Then softly, "Tell him Patricia called." I switched to Channel 9 immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I adjusted the dial. The 10 minutes crawled by, filled only with the ambient hum of the radio and the distant sound of Carlos making his security rounds. When I switched back to Channel 7, the frequency had returned to its usual midnight emptiness. Aircraft N847TC showed up on a Tuesday night in early November. I was checking the maintenance log when Elena burst through the break room door, her face pale in the harsh light. "That plane," she said, pointing toward the window. "The Cessna that just landed. Registration N847TC. I looked out at the tarmac, where a small white aircraft sat near the fuel pumps, its engine ticking as it cooled. Nothing seemed unusual about it, just another late arrival looking for fuel and overnight parking. "Protocol 4, Elena continued. "We're supposed to refer them to day shift." "It's just a Cessna, probably some businessman flying in from Sacramento." "Danny." Elena grabbed my arm, her grip firm. "Look at the registration again." I squinted through the window, making out the numbers painted on the aircraft's tail. N847TC. According to the protocol, this was the plane we were supposed to avoid servicing. "I'll handle it," I said, but Elena shook her head. "No contact. That's what the protocol means. We log it, but we don't approach the aircraft." Through the window, I could see a figure moving around the plane, a pilot doing his post-flight inspection. He looked normal enough from this distance, just another aviator in a leather jacket checking his equipment. But something about his movements seemed off, too fluid, like he was performing steps he'd rehearsed countless times. The pilot began walking toward our building, and I got my first clear look at him. Mid-40s, average height, wearing clothes that looked like they came from a 1970s aviation catalog. His leather jacket bore patches from airlines that had gone out of business decades ago. He knocked on the office door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the building. Elena and I exchanged glances, neither of us moving to answer. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Hello?" The pilot's voice carried through the door, tinged with frustration. "I need fuel and a place to tie down for the night." I started toward the door, but Elena caught my sleeve. "Protocol," she whispered. We waited in silence as the pilot tried the door handle, then walked around the building, checking windows. His footsteps circled the structure twice before finally fading away. When I looked out the window again, both the pilot and his aircraft had vanished from the tarmac, leaving no trace they'd ever been there. "What just happened?" I asked. Elena was already writing in the logbook, her handwriting careful and precise. N847 TC arrival 11:47 p.m. Departure 12:03 a.m. Referred to day shift per protocol. "Elena, what just happened?" She closed the logbook and looked at me with eyes that held too many secrets. "Some aircraft aren't meant to be serviced at night, Danny. Some pilots aren't meant to be helped. The incident with N847 TC left me shaken, but it was nothing compared to what happened the following Thursday. I was replacing a fuel filter on a Piper Cherokee when I heard the compressor kick on in Hangar 7. The sound cut through the quiet night air like a rusty blade, a deep, mechanical wheezing that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than any compressor should reach. My watch read 12:47 a.m., right in the middle of the forbidden window. Protocol 1 was crystal clear: never enter Hangar 7 between midnight and 3 a.m. Don't investigate the compressor. But the sound was wrong, not the steady rhythm of normal equipment, but something erratic, almost desperate, like machinery choking on its own parts. I tried to focus on the Cherokee's engine, but the noise from Hangar 7 grew louder, more insistent. Through the small window in the maintenance bay, I could see the hangar's exterior lights casting a sickly yellow glow across the tarmac. The big sliding doors were closed tight, just as they should be. But something about the building felt different tonight. Hungry. Elena appeared at my shoulder, making me jump. She moved quietly for someone wearing steel-toed boots. "Don't even think about it," she said, following my gaze toward Hangar 7. "That doesn't sound like any compressor I've ever heard." "It's not." Elena picked up a wrench from my toolbox, turning it over in her hands. Hangar 7 used to house the charter operation back in the 80s. Big planes, corporate jets, that sort of thing. Owner was a guy named Vincent Kellerman, ran freight and passenger service up and down the coast. The sound from the hangar shifted, becoming more rhythmic, but no less disturbing, like someone operating a machine they didn't quite understand. What happened to Kellerman? Plane crash, December 1987, flying back from San Francisco in bad weather, went down in the hills near Coalinga. They found the wreckage 3 days later, scattered across about half a mile of rangeland. Helena set the wrench down, aligning it precisely with the others in my toolbox. But here's the thing. Kellerman's body was never in that wreckage. Ejected during impact. That's what everyone figured. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks combing those hills, found pieces of fuselage, chunks of engine, passenger seats, but no Vincent Kellerman. Elena glanced toward Hangar 7, where the compressor sound had taken on an almost conversational quality, like machinery trying to speak. Until 3 months later, when day shift found him in Hangar 7, sitting at his old desk like nothing had happened. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Found him how? Dead. Had been for months, according to the coroner. But there he was, dressed in his pilot uniform, flight log open to December 15th, the day of the crash. He'd been writing in it, same entry over and over, weather deteriorating, requesting vectors to alternate, page after page of the same line, written in his own hand. The compressor sound stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt somehow worse than the noise. I strained to hear anything from the hangar. Footsteps, voices, the normal sounds of equipment cooling down. Nothing. They sealed Hangar 7 after that, Elena continued. Kept it locked for almost 5 years. When they finally reopened it, the compressor would run at random times, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Maintenance crews would find tools scattered around, flight logs filled with that same message, coffee cups still warm on desks that hadn't been used in years. And the airport just accepts this? Airport needs the hangar space. Kellerman's estate still pays the lease through some trust fund his lawyer set up. As long as the bills get paid and nobody gets hurt, management looks the other way. Elena checked her watch. Speaking of which, you've got about an hour before you need to clean that coffee pot. She walked away, leaving me alone with the Cherokee and the oppressive silence from Hangar 7. I tried to concentrate on my work, but my attention kept drifting to that yellow-lit building across the tarmac. Twice I thought I saw movement in the windows, shadows that didn't correspond to anything outside the hangar. Carlos drove past during his 1:30 a.m. rounds, his old Ford backfiring as he downshifted. He slowed near Hangar 7, and I watched him through my toolbox window. The security guard sat in his truck for nearly 5 minutes, engine idling, staring at the hangar doors. Then he drove away quickly, his tires squealing against the asphalt. At 2:15 a.m., I made my way to the break room to handle the coffee pot. The Mr. Coffee machine sat on its dedicated table, the glass carafe half full of liquid so dark it looked like motor oil. Steam rose from the surface in lazy spirals, even though the heating element should have shut off hours ago. I reached for the pot, then hesitated. The coffee was moving, not bubbling or percolating, but moving like something alive was stirring it from within. Shapes formed in the dark liquid, faces maybe, or hands reaching up from the bottom of the carafe. My timer buzzed. 2:30 a.m. exactly. I grabbed the pot quickly, emptying it into the sink and running hot water to rinse away the residue. The liquid that came out wasn't coffee. It was thicker, darker, with an oily consistency that clung to the porcelain. It smelled like burnt metal and something else, something organic that made my stomach lurch. While scrubbing the carafe, I noticed something floating in the dregs at the bottom. A small piece of paper, yellowed with age and partially dissolved. I fished it out carefully, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Weather deteriorating, requesting vectors to alternate. The same message Elena had described from Kellerman's flight log, written in fading blue ink that looked decades old. I stared at the paper until it crumbled between my fingers, then finished cleaning the coffee pot with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The rest of the night passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The protocols weren't just guidelines anymore. They were a barrier between me and something that had been waiting patiently for years. Something that knew I was there, knew I was learning the rules, and was testing my commitment to following them. When I walked the fence line that morning, I found the north gate hanging open, the chain lying in the dirt, like it had been cut. But as I bent to close it, I caught a glimpse of movement in the citrus grove beyond, a figure in a pilot's uniform standing among the orange trees, staring back at me with eyes that held the patient emptiness of someone who had been waiting far too long to come home. I slammed the gate shut and drove home faster than I should have, but I couldn't escape the feeling that Vincent Kellerman had finally found someone willing to listen to his story. I called in sick the next 2 nights, spending the time drinking beer in my apartment and trying to convince myself that what I'd seen in the citrus grove was just shadows and exhaustion. But the rent wouldn't pay itself, and Antonio left 3 increasingly concerned voicemails asking if I was coming back. On Sunday night, I returned to find Elena waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her Honda Accord with her arms crossed. "You look like hell," she said, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the terminal. "Thanks for the pep talk." "Danny, listen to me." She stopped, grabbing my arm. "I know what you saw out there. We all see things working nights at Chamber. The question is whether you're going to let it drive you away or learn to live with it." "Live with what, exactly? A dead pilot wandering around the orange trees?" Elena glanced around the empty parking lot before answering. "Vincent Kellerman died owing debts. Not money, something deeper. He made promises he couldn't keep, took shortcuts he shouldn't have taken. Death doesn't always settle accounts, Danny. Sometimes it just changes the payment schedule." She walked away before I could ask what she meant, leaving me standing under the buzzing security lights with more questions than answers. The night started normally enough. I completed my equipment checks, reviewed the maintenance log, and settled into the familiar routine. Carlos made his rounds on schedule, and the man in coveralls appeared at his usual time, nodding his acknowledgement before disappearing behind the fuel tanks. Everything felt predictable until 1:47 a.m., when my radio crackled to life. "Chandler Ground, this is N847TC requesting permission to taxi." I fumbled for the handset, checking the frequency. Channel 7, just as protocol required. But this wasn't the woman asking for Johnny. This was a male voice, crisp and professional, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of flying. "N847TC, this is ground control," the voice continued when I didn't respond. "Requesting taxi clearance to runway 27 for departure." According to the protocols, I should have stayed silent. N847TC was the aircraft we weren't supposed to service, the one that had vanished after Elena and I refused to fuel it. But something about the pilot's voice made me reach for the handset. "N847TC, this is Chandler Ground," I heard myself saying. "Runway 27 is closed for maintenance." Static filled the channel for several heartbeats. Then, negative, ground control. "Runway appears clear from my position, requesting immediate departure clearance." I looked out the window toward the runway. Empty asphalt stretched away into darkness, no aircraft in sight. But the voice on the radio sounded so normal, so routine, that I began to doubt what I was seeing. "N847TC, what is your current position?" "Holding short of runway 27, ground control." "I have been holding short for 37 years. How much longer do you intend to keep me waiting?" The handset slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the desk. 37 years. That would put the original request sometime in 1987, the year Vincent Kellerman's plane went down in the hills near Coalinga. I switched to Channel 9, hands trembling as I adjusted the dial. 10 minutes. That's how long the protocol said to wait. But as I sat there listening to empty static, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. Professional, patient, but carrying an undertone of frustration that suggested the pilot had been waiting far longer than any reasonable person should. When I switched back to Channel 7, the frequency was quiet again. The coffee pot incident that night was worse than before. I approached the machine at 2:25 a.m., giving myself extra time to complete the cleaning ritual. The carafe was full again, despite being empty when I'd arrived. The liquid inside moved with that same organic motion, but now I could make out distinct shapes forming in the dark surface. Not just faces, but entire scenes playing out like movies projected onto the coffee. I saw an aircraft cockpit, instruments glowing in the darkness, a man's hands gripping the yoke, knuckles white with tension. Rain streaming across the windscreen, and beyond it, hills rising up to meet the plane. The scene repeated over and over, like a recording stuck on loop. At exactly 2:30 a.m., I emptied the pot and began scrubbing. This time, multiple pieces of paper floated in the dregs, fragments of flight logs, weather reports, radio transcripts, all in Vincent Kellerman's handwriting, all related to that final flight from San Francisco. Weather deteriorating rapidly. Unable to maintain altitude. Requesting emergency vectors. Fuel running low. Can anyone hear me? I collected the papers, spreading them out on the break room table. Together, they told the story of a pilot fighting weather and mechanical problems, growing increasingly desperate as his situation deteriorated. But the timestamps were wrong. Some entries were dated weeks after the crash. Others showed times that jumped backward and forward without pattern. The final fragment was different. Fresher paper. Ink that looked wet despite having come from the bottom of a coffee pot that should have been dry. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. They won't let me land. Every night I request clearance. Every night they refuse. The runway is clear. I can see it from up here. Why won't they let me come home? I swept the papers into the trash, but not before noticing that this final message was dated today. The fence walk revealed the north gate standing open again, but this time I wasn't alone. Carlos was there, staring through the gap into the citrus grove beyond. His security uniform looked rumpled, and he held his flashlight like a weapon. "You see him too," he said without turning around. "The pilot." Carlos. Been seeing him for 3 years now. Started about a month after I began working nights here. He finally faced me, and I could see exhaustion etched deep in his features. First time I thought he was a trespasser. Radioed it in, called the sheriff's department. They found nothing. Through the open gate, I could make out a figure moving between the orange trees. The same pilot's uniform, the same patient stride. But tonight he wasn't alone. Other shapes moved with him. Passengers, maybe, or crew members from flights that never made it home. "Protocol says don't look through the opening," I said. "Protocol says a lot of things." Carlos switched off his flashlight, plunging us into darkness. Question is, what happens when the protocols stop working? We closed the gate together, snapping the heavy lock into place. But as we walked back toward our vehicles, I could hear voices from the citrus grove. Pilots calling out coordinates, passengers asking about arrival times, ground crew requesting permission to approach aircraft that would never land. Vincent Kellerman wasn't the only one who'd never made it home. Chandler Airport sat on a crossroads of sorts, a place where the living and the dead shared the same airspace, following rules that kept them safely separated. At least, that's what I told myself as I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, trying not to think about what would happen if those rules ever failed. The next morning, I drove to the Fresno County Library instead of going home. If I was going to keep working at Chandler Airport, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The reference librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Chen, helped me dig through archived newspapers and accident reports from the 1980s. Vincent Kellerman's story was worse than Elena had told me. According to the Fresno Bee archives, Kellerman Aviation had been struggling financially in the months before the crash. The company was behind on hangar rent, insurance payments, and employee wages. Vincent had been taking increasingly dangerous charter flights, accepting cash payments for trips that legitimate operators wouldn't touch. The December 15th flight wasn't supposed to happen. Weather services had issued severe storm warnings for the entire Central Valley, grounding most aircraft. but Kellerman had taken off anyway, carrying 3 passengers who'd paid him $5,000 cash to fly them to San Francisco, despite the conditions. The passengers' names were listed in the accident report. Maria Santos, age 34, an accountant from Modesto. Robert Chin, age 41, a businessman from Stockton. And Patricia Morales, age 28, a teacher from Fresno who was flying to San Francisco to visit her sick mother. Patricia Morales, the same name as the woman's voice on the radio, asking for Johnny. I spent 3 more hours reading through related articles, obituaries, and follow-up investigations. Patricia had been engaged to a man named Johnny Gutierrez, a mechanic who worked at Chandler Airport in the 1980s. According to her obituary, she'd been planning to marry him the following spring. Johnny Gutierrez had quit his job at Chandler 3 days after the crash. No forwarding address, no final paycheck collected. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind tools, personal belongings, and a fiancée who would never come home. When I arrived for my shift that evening, Antonio was waiting in the break room with 2 cups of coffee from the 7-Eleven across town. His face carried the weight of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for months. "You went digging," he said, sliding 1 cup across the table. "Had to. These protocols, they're not just random rules, are they?" Antonio sipped his coffee, studying my face. "Sit down, Danny. Time you learned the whole story." I took the chair across from him, noting how he'd positioned himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of both exits. Even in our own break room, Antonio maintained the habits of someone who'd learned not to trust his surroundings completely. "Chandler Airport sits on cursed ground," he began. "Not cursed like in the movies, but cursed the way places get cursed when too many people die with unfinished business. Vincent Kellerman was just the beginning." The beginning of what? The patterns, the rules, the things that happen when the living and the dead share the same space. Antonio leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. After Kellerman's crash, strange things started happening. Pilots reported seeing aircraft on radar that weren't there. Ground crew found tools moved overnight, equipment that had been shut down running at full power. The night shift started quitting. Good people, experienced workers, walking away from steady jobs without explanation. So management created the protocols? Management doesn't know about the protocols. These rules came from us, the people who work here, who've learned what it takes to coexist with what's left behind. Antonio's hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he was trying to warm himself. Every protocol represents someone who didn't make it home. Vincent Kellerman and his passengers, they're trapped here, reliving that final flight over and over. The protocols keep them contained, give them boundaries they can't cross. What happens if we stop following them? Antonio's expression darkened. "You remember Tommy Nguyen, the mechanic who disappeared 3 weeks ago?" I nodded, recalling Antonio's earlier story about the scattered tools and running truck. Tommy thought he was smarter than the protocols. Started testing them, seeing how far he could bend the rules before something broke. Antonio stood, walking to the window that faced Hangar 7. Protocol 1 says never enter the hangar between midnight and 3 a.m. Tommy figured that was just superstition. He started going in anyway, documenting what he found. And Tommy found Vincent Kellerman's office, exactly as he'd left it in 1987. Flight logs, coffee cups, personal belongings, everything preserved like a museum exhibit. But the office shouldn't exist anymore. That space was renovated in the 90s, turned into storage for aircraft parts. The coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted bitter. How is that possible? Time doesn't work the same way for the dead. They exist in moments, replaying scenes from their lives without regard for what the living world has become. Antonio returned to his seat, his movements careful and controlled. Tommy started spending entire nights in that office, reading Kellerman's flight logs, trying to understand what had gone wrong during that final flight. He thought he could help somehow, maybe find a way to give them peace. Did he? Tommy found something all right, but it wasn't peace. Antonio pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a page torn from a spiral notebook, covered with handwriting I recognized as Tommy's. Found this on my desk 3 weeks ago, the night before Tommy disappeared. I unfolded the paper, reading Tommy's neat printing. Antonio. They want me to fly with them. Kellerman says there's room for one more passenger, that I can help navigate. The weather's getting worse, and they need someone who understands modern instruments. Patricia keeps asking about Johnny, and I think I know where he is. I think I know why he left. I'm going to help them land. Bring them home. If something goes wrong, tell my sister in Sacramento that I'm sorry. Tommy. They recruited him, I said, the implications settling over me like fog. The dead passengers and crew, they're trying to complete their flight, and they need living people to help them. That's our theory. Elena thinks they're building towards something, gathering enough people to finally land that aircraft. Carlos believes they're trying to recreate the conditions of the original flight, hoping to change the outcome. Antonio took the paper back, refolding it carefully. Either way, the protocols exist to prevent recruitment. As long as we follow the rules, we stay in the world of the living. But Tommy broke the rules. Tommy broke the rules, and now he's part of their crew. We know because Elena's been tracking the radio transmissions. N847TC now has 4 voices requesting clearance: Vincent Kellerman, Patricia Morales, and 2 others we can't identify. One of them sounds like Tommy. The break room felt smaller suddenly, the familiar space closing in around me. Outside, I could hear Carlos making his security rounds, his truck engine coughing as he navigated the perimeter road. Everything seemed normal, routine, safe. But underneath the normalcy, something hungry was waiting for the next person to make a mistake. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Antonio checked his watch. 11:43 p.m. Because Protocol 7 is about to change. Elena found new writing on the north gate this morning, carved into the metal like someone had used aviation tools to etch letters. What did it say? Gate must remain open after midnight. New passengers boarding soon. The weight of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Protocol 7 had always been about closing the gate, keeping the dead contained within the citrus grove. If the rule was changing, if the gate needed to stay open, then something fundamental was shifting in the balance between the living and the dead. They're getting stronger, I said. Or more desperate. Either way, tonight feels different. Elena's monitoring the radio, Carlos is doubling his security rounds, and I'm staying late to help with any problems that come up. Antonio stood, adjusting his tool belt. Question is, are you ready to see this through? Or do you want to walk away like Johnny Gutierrez did? I thought about Johnny, abandoning his job and his fiancée rather than face whatever was haunting Chandler Airport. I thought about Tommy, who'd tried to help and disappeared into whatever realm the dead inhabited. And I thought about the voice on the radio, asking for Johnny night after night for 37 years. I'm staying, I said. Antonio nodded, unsurprised by my decision. Then you'd better understand something important. The protocols aren't just rules. They're a war between the living and the dead. And tonight, I think that war is about to escalate. The first sign that tonight was different came at 12:15 a.m. when the man in coveralls appeared 15 minutes early. Instead of his usual path toward the cargo dock, he walked directly toward our building, stopping just outside the main window. For the first time since I'd started working at Chandler, he looked directly at me. His face was wrong. Not disfigured or monstrous, just wrong in the way a photograph looks wrong when someone moves during the exposure. Features that didn't quite align. Expressions that shifted between frames of movement. He raised his hand, not in greeting, but pointing toward Hangar 7. I backed away from the window, reaching for my radio to call Antonio. But when I looked outside again, the man was gone. "Elena, you copy." I spoke into the handset, switching to the maintenance frequency we used for coordination. "Copy, Danny. Everything okay?" The man in coveralls, he broke pattern. Static filled the channel for several heartbeats. Then Elena's voice, tighter than before. "Antonio, you hear that?" I heard. "Everyone stay alert. Danny, what's your position?" "Maintenance bay working on the Cherokee." But Antonio, he pointed toward Hangar 7. "Acknowledged. Whatever happens tonight, nobody approaches that hangar. I don't care what you see or hear." I tried to return to my work, but concentration was impossible. Every sound from outside, wind through the chain-link fence, Carlos's truck making rounds, the distant hum of equipment, seemed amplified and threatening. At 12:47 a.m., the compressor in Hangar 7 kicked on, right on schedule. But tonight, the sound carried voices, faint but distinguishable. Multiple people talking over each other, like a radio frequency crowded with transmissions. My radio crackled. "Chandler ground. This is N847TC requesting immediate departure clearance." Vincent Kellerman's voice, but clearer than before. Less static, more present. "N847TC, stand by," I replied, following the script Antonio had taught me. "Negative, ground control. We have been standing by for 37 years. Our passengers are becoming impatient. N847TC, runway 27 is closed for maintenance. Ground control, runway 27 appears clear from our position. We have visual confirmation of approach lights and windsock. Request you verify runway status immediately." I looked toward the runway, knowing I'd see empty asphalt. Instead, I saw lights. Not the normal runway lighting, but the softer glow of older equipment, the kind that had been replaced decades ago. And there, positioned at the threshold, sat a white Cessna with registration N847TC clearly visible on its tail. The aircraft looked solid, real, casting shadows in the runway lights. But the shadows were wrong, stretching in directions that didn't match the light sources. "Elena, Carlos, are you seeing this?" Elena's voice came through immediately. "Seeing what?" "The runway. There's an aircraft at the threshold." "Danny, the runway's empty. I'm looking at it right now from the fuel depot." Carlos chimed in. "Nothing on the runway from my position either. You sure you're not seeing things?" But I was sure. The Cessna sat there, engine running, navigation lights blinking in sequence. Through the cockpit windows, I could make out figures, pilot and passengers, waiting for clearance that would never come. "Ground control," Kellerman's voice resumed. "We show ready for departure. Passengers are aboard. Baggage loaded. All pre-flight checks complete. Please expedite our clearance. N847TC, negative on departure clearance. Runway 27 remains closed." This time, a different voice came through the radio. Female, desperate. "Ground control, this is Patricia Morales, passenger on N847TC. I need to get home. Johnny's waiting for me. We're supposed to be married in the spring." My throat went dry. Patricia's voice carried a pleading quality that made my chest ache. 37 years of waiting, of calling out for someone who'd abandoned her to avoid facing what she'd become. "Patricia," I said, breaking protocol. "Johnny's not here anymore." Silence stretched across the frequency. Then softly, "He promised he'd wait. He promised we'd be together." "Patricia, Johnny left. He couldn't handle." "You're lying." The transmission exploded with static and fury. "Johnny's here. I can see him. He's standing by the gate, waiting for me to come home." I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement near the north gate. The chain-link barrier stood open, just as the new protocol required, but I couldn't see anyone in the citrus grove beyond. Antonio's voice crackled through my radio. "Danny, get back inside. Now." "Antonio, I think Johnny Gutierrez is here. Patricia can see him." "Danny, Johnny Gutierrez died 15 years ago. Car accident on Highway 99, just north of Merced. Elena found his obituary last week while researching the airport's history." The information hit me like a physical blow. Johnny hadn't run away to escape his grief. He died, probably driving too fast on a dark road, consumed by guilt over Patricia's death. For 15 years, his spirit had been wandering, unable to find peace while his fiancée remained trapped at the airport. "Then who's been walking the perimeter?" I asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Antonio replied. "But right now, you need to get back inside and stay away from that gate." I started toward the building, but movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. A figure was walking across the tarmac, not the man in coveralls, but someone in civilian clothes. Jeans, work boots, a flannel shirt that looked like it had been worn for decades. As he moved through the runway lights, I got a clear look at his face. Mid-30s, Hispanic features, with the kind of lean build that comes from physical labor. He walked with purpose, heading directly toward the open north gate. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the pain in his posture, the weight of guilt and regret that had followed him for 37 years. Johnny Gutierrez had finally come home. "Patricia," he called out, his voice carrying across the empty tarmac. "Patricia, I'm here. I'm sorry I'm late." The radio crackled. "Johnny? Johnny, is that really you?" "I'm here, Minamore. I came as soon as I could." "I've been waiting. The plane's ready to leave, but they won't give us clearance." Johnny reached the gate, standing in the opening between the living world and whatever realm the dead inhabited. "I know. I'm going to fix this." He turned toward our building, and I could see his face clearly now. Death hadn't changed him much. He still looked like the young mechanic who'd worked at Chandler in the 1980s. But his eyes held decades of guilt and longing, the accumulated weight of knowing his fiancée was trapped while he wandered free. "Ground control," he said, though he wasn't carrying a radio. "This is Johnny Gutierrez requesting permission to board N847TC as passenger." My radio automatically responded to his transmission. "Say again." "Ground control, I'm requesting permission to board N847TC. I have unfinished business with the passengers." Antonio's voice cut through. "Danny, do not respond to that transmission." But I was already reaching for the handset. Johnny had spent 37 years searching for a way to reunite with Patricia. Now he was here, ready to board an aircraft that existed somewhere between life and death. "Johnny," I said into the radio, "are you sure about this?" He nodded toward the building, though I wasn't sure he could actually see me. Patricia's been waiting long enough. Time for me to keep my promise. Johnny, if you board that aircraft, I know what happens. Been talking to Tommy Nguyen. He explained the situation. Johnny's voice carried a peace I hadn't expected. Some promises are worth keeping, even if it costs everything. He walked through the gate into the citrus grove, disappearing among the orange trees. Moments later, my radio crackled with Patricia's voice, filled with joy I hadn't heard before. Johnny. Oh God, Johnny, you're here. I'm here, Patricia. I'm never leaving again. The runway lights began to flicker, and I could see N847TC starting to move, taxiing slowly toward the active runway. Whatever had been holding the aircraft in limbo for 37 years was finally releasing its grip. But as I watched the ghost plane prepare for takeoff, I realized that some departures create arrivals, and something else was coming to fill the void left by Vincent Kellerman's crew. N847TC reached the end of the runway at exactly 1:33 a.m. I watched through the maintenance bay window as the aircraft turned, aligning itself with the centerline for takeoff. The engine note changed, rising to a pitch that seemed to vibrate through the building's foundation. Ground control, N847TC ready for departure. Vincent Kellerman's voice came through the radio one final time. All passengers aboard, all systems normal, requesting takeoff clearance for San Francisco. I looked at the handset, knowing that my next words would either trap them forever or finally set them free. Antonio had made the protocols clear. Never give clearance to N847TC. But listening to Patricia's laughter as she reunited with Johnny, hearing the relief in Kellerman's voice as his long vigil neared its end, I couldn't bring myself to deny them passage. N847TC, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. You are cleared for takeoff runway 27. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. Fly safe. Copy. Ground control. N847TC departing runway 27. Thank you for your patience. The Cessna began its takeoff roll, gaining speed as it moved down the asphalt. But instead of lifting off normally, the aircraft seemed to fade as it accelerated, becoming translucent against the runway lights. By the time it reached rotation speed, N847TC was more ghost than machine, a pale outline that climbed into the night sky before vanishing completely. For the first time in 37 years, Chandler Airport's runway was truly empty. The silence that followed felt different from the usual night quiet. Heavier, more expectant. Like the pause between lightning and thunder, when the air itself holds its breath waiting for what comes next. My radio crackled. Danny, what the hell did you just do? Antonio's voice carried a mixture of shock and anger. I gave them clearance. They've been waiting long enough. Those protocols exist for a reason. You can't just... Antonio's transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. I tried reaching Elena and Carlos, but got no response from either. The radio frequencies had gone dead, leaving me alone in the maintenance bay with equipment that suddenly felt alien and threatening. The compressor in Hangar 7 stopped running. After months of hearing that mechanical wheeze every night between midnight and 3 a.m., the sudden silence was more disturbing than the noise had ever been. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the tarmac for any sign of my co-workers. Carlos's security truck sat abandoned near the fuel depot, driver's door hanging open, engine still running. Elena's desk light was visible through the administrative building windows, but I couldn't see any movement inside. The entire airport felt deserted, as if N847TC's departure had somehow taken the living world with it. Then I heard footsteps, heavy work boots on concrete, moving with deliberate purpose across the tarmac. But these weren't the measured steps of the man in coveralls, or Johnny's guilt-laden stride toward the gate. These footsteps carried authority, the confident pace of someone who belonged here and had business to attend to. A figure emerged from the shadows near Hangar 7, and I recognized him immediately despite the fact that I'd never seen him before. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flight suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. His hair was perfectly styled in the way pilots maintained their appearance, and his posture radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of commanding aircraft and crews. This wasn't Vincent Kellerman or any member of his doomed flight. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had been waiting for the runway to clear so he could claim his turn. "You must be the new mechanic," he said, his voice carrying easily across the empty tarmac. "I'm Captain Morrison, Federal Aviation Administration. I'm here to conduct an inspection." Something about his introduction felt wrong. FAA inspectors didn't conduct inspections at 1:45 a.m., and they certainly didn't appear out of thin air after ghost planes departed into the night sky. But his credentials looked authentic enough. Badge, identification card, official clipboard with forms that rustled in the slight breeze. "I wasn't notified of any inspection," I said, keeping my distance. "Emergency inspection. We received reports of unauthorized aircraft operations, violations of airspace restrictions, failure to follow proper ground control procedures." Morrison consulted his clipboard, making notes with a pen that scratched too loudly against the paper. "I'm afraid we'll need to shut down all operations pending a full investigation. You'll have to talk to the day shift supervisor. I'm just maintenance." Morrison looked up from his forms, and I saw his eyes for the first time. They were pilot's eyes, sharp, focused, used to seeing things from altitude. But there was something else there, something hungry and patient that reminded me of predators waiting for prey to make a mistake. "Actually, you're exactly who I need to speak with. You just cleared an unregistered aircraft for takeoff without proper authorization. That's a federal violation that could result in criminal charges." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Morrison was right. I had given clearance to N847TC, breaking protocols that had been carefully maintained for decades. But looking at this supposed FAA inspector, I began to understand that my violation had opened a door that someone had been waiting years to walk through. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to inspect your maintenance logs, review your training records, and ensure that Chandler Airport is operating within federal guidelines." Morrison smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something predatory. "But first, I need you to open Hangar 7. There have been reports of unauthorized activity in that building." "Hangar 7 is sealed, has been for months." "Sealed by whose authority?" "I don't see any federal notices, no proper documentation. As far as I'm concerned, that hangar should be available for inspection." Morrison stepped closer, and I caught a scent that reminded me of old aircraft fuel mixed with something organic and unpleasant. "Unless you're hiding something in there?" The challenge was clear. Morrison wanted access to Hangar 7, to whatever remained of Vincent Kellerman's operation, now that the original tenant had finally departed, and my violation of protocol had given him the legal justification he needed to demand entry. "I don't have keys to Hangar 7. "That's fine. I do." Morrison produced a ring of keys that looked decades old, brass and steel worn smooth by countless hands. He walked toward Hangar 7, with the confident stride of someone who had been planning this moment for years. I followed at a distance, my radio crackling with static as I tried one more time to reach Antonio or Elena. Nothing. Whatever was happening tonight, I was facing it alone. Morrison reached the hangar's main entrance, a massive sliding door that hadn't been opened since Tommy M. Nguyen's disappearance. He selected a key from his ring, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a click that seemed to echo across the entire airport. "After you," he said, gesturing toward the open doorway. Beyond the threshold, Hangar 7 waited in darkness. But it wasn't the empty darkness of an abandoned building. This was the thick, expectant darkness of a space that had been preparing for occupancy. Equipment hummed softly in the depths of the hangar, and I could smell coffee brewing, hear the rustle of papers being organized, the quiet sounds of an office coming to life. Vincent Kellerman's operation was gone, departed with N847TC and its reunited passengers. But something else had moved into the vacant space, something that had been waiting patiently for its opportunity to establish operations at Chandler Airport. Morrison stepped through the doorway, and the darkness seemed to welcome him home. "Coming, mechanic? We have a lot of work to do, and the night is still young." I stood at the threshold, knowing that crossing it would change everything. The protocols had been designed to maintain balance between the living and the dead, to keep supernatural forces contained within acceptable boundaries. By giving clearance to N847TC, I had disrupted that balance, and Captain Morrison, whoever or whatever he really was, intended to make sure I understood the consequences of my actions. I stepped across the threshold. The darkness inside Hangar 7 wasn't empty anymore. Vincent Kellerman's office had been restored to perfect 1987 condition. Wood-paneled walls, aviation charts, coffee stains on the desk blotter. But the nameplate read, "Captain J. Morrison, Federal Aviation Administration," and the papers scattered across the surface bore today's date. "Excellent," Morrison said, settling into the chair behind the desk like he'd been using it for years. "Now we can discuss your new position." My new position. Every operation needs qualified ground personnel. Kellerman learned that lesson too late. Tried to run everything himself, cut corners on staffing, ignored proper protocols. Morrison opened a file cabinet that definitely hadn't been there when Tommy Nguyen disappeared. "I prefer a more systematic approach." The cabinet contained personnel files for every night shift worker at Chandler Airport, going back decades. I saw Tommy's folder, thick with photographs and handwritten notes. Elena's file sat right beside it, along with Carlos's security records and my own maintenance reports. "You've been watching us, studying you, learning your strengths, your weaknesses, your willingness to bend rules when circumstances demand it." Morrison pulled out my file, spreading its contents across the desk. "Tonight proved you have the flexibility I need in a ground operations supervisor." The photographs in my file showed me following the protocols, cleaning the coffee pot, walking the fence line, nodding to the man in coveralls. But they also captured moments I didn't remember being photographed. Me researching Kellerman's crash at the library, talking to Antonio in the break room, standing at the hangar threshold just minutes ago. What happened to Elena and Carlos? They're safe, reassigned to day shift operations, effective immediately. Captain Morrison's aviation services will be conducting all-night operations from now on. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled like a businessman closing a deal. "The question is whether you're willing to help establish proper procedures." Through the hangar windows, I could see the first hints of dawn creeping across the horizon. My watch read 5:17 a.m., well past the time I should have completed my fence walk and headed home. But the routine that had governed my nights for months felt distant now, replaced by something larger and more complex. "What kind of procedures?" Morrison smiled, and for the first time since meeting him, The expression looked genuinely pleased rather than predatory. Chandler Airport has always been a crossroads, Danny. A place where different worlds intersect. Kellerman understood that, but lacked the vision to properly manage the traffic flow. He gestured toward charts on the wall, not standard aviation maps, but something else entirely. Flight patterns that traced impossible routes, connecting cities that didn't exist on any earthly map. Arrival and departure schedules for aircraft with registrations I'd never seen before. You'll learn the new protocols soon enough. They're more complex than Kellerman's simple rules, but far more effective at maintaining operational efficiency. Morrison handed me a clipboard with forms that felt warm to the touch. Your signature here accepts the position of Night Operations Supervisor, Chandler Airport Special Services Division. I looked at the contract, knowing that signing it would change everything. The old protocols had been about survival, about coexisting with the supernatural forces that haunted the airport. These new procedures were about collaboration, about actively participating in operations that existed somewhere between the living world and whatever lay beyond. But as I held the pen Morrison offered me, I thought about Patricia's laughter when Johnny finally arrived, about Vincent Kellerman's relief as N847TC finally received clearance for takeoff. Sometimes breaking the rules led to better outcomes than following them. I signed my name at the bottom of the contract. Morrison filed the paperwork efficiently, then handed me a new set of keys and a revised protocol manual. Welcome to the team, Danny. Your first shift starts tonight at 11 p.m. Don't be late. We have a very busy schedule ahead of us. As I drove home through the early morning traffic, Fresno waking up around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just enrolled in something far more complex than aircraft maintenance. The protocols in my passenger seat outlined procedures for handling arrivals from destinations that didn't appear on any standard charts, refueling aircraft that ran on something other than aviation fuel, and coordinating with ground crews who weren't entirely human. But for the first time since starting work at Chandler Airport, I wasn't afraid of what the night shift might bring. I was curious.